In this video, I'm going to quickly introduce myself. Then I'm going to give you 8 tips if you're a crocheter and want to start knitting, or if you're a full-on beginner. This is the first video of a series I'm going to call CraftyChat, which is about knitting techniques, my favorite yarns, tips and tricks I can give you, and just generally where I talk about knitting, maybe a bit more of a podcast type, but I'm trying to kind of lay it out a bit more practical for you. Whereas my other series, Crafty Chronicles, is more about vlogs and kind of project updates and maybe showing a bit more things on the go. But yeah, that's generally what these series are about. A bit more about myself. As I said, my name is Chiara, I'm 27 years old and I live in Zurich, Switzerland. I started crocheting again after I didn't really crochet after my childhood. I started again 1.5 years ago, or no, it's already 2 years ago actually, when I just got a hook and yarn and crocheted something by watching a YouTube video, which was so much fun. I fell in love with it instantly, and then I don't think there have been many days at a time where I haven't crocheted or knitted since. So yeah, that kind of set the start for a very intense passion for a new craft. And so what actually happened is I got this yarn, the wool by We Are Knitters, in this sprinkled color, and I crocheted a sample with a 15mm hook first, and then I just thought that it looked a bit, kind of the pattern of a crochet stitch was almost like, I don't know, like hiding the speckled texture of, or kind of the speckled pattern of this yarn, and I felt like it wasn't really visible, and so I thought this yarn is probably better to be knitted. And then I just bought the right needles and knitted my first sweater, and it's actually this sweater. This is the first sweater I knitted using the wool, and I made it up completely like from my head, because crocheting was the same thing for me. I mostly got garments I already had and took the measurements and then reconstructed them, but I would always kind of build the different panels and then kind of sew them together and construct a garment that way. And so I applied the logic of constructing it by making the panels and putting it together onto the sweater, and that was kind of my first mistake because I didn't want to look up anything. This is kind of also where I'm coming from with making this video, because I kind of want to tell you some of the mistakes I made or things I would have liked to know when I was a crocheter and wanted to start to knit, and just something that kind of set me on the right path from the beginning, because it might not look that bad, but it's just like the seams up here and everything. This sweater is not that comfortable to wear, like I barely ever wear it. And so yeah, I hope you don't make the same mistakes as I did, and I hope that this video can be a bit of a help to get you set on the right path. So here comes the first tip. In crocheting, you kind of construct everything in panels, right? Or at least I did. I didn't crochet that much in the round because like when you started a new round, there was always kind of this chance of there being a visible gap. And I know there's ways to hide that, but I would just always make panels and then sew them together, because that also gave me the freedom to maybe also adjust sizing a bit more later. When I got onto knitting, I thought it would be the same, right? I didn't really know about knitting in the round. And so my first tip for you is to kind of throw the construction logic of crochet, just like throw it away and just completely like keep it apart from what you're doing in knitting. And in knitting, try to construct as much as you can in one go, which means knitting in the round, it might sound complicated or like another method you need to learn before you can get even started, but it's so easy, because the essential thing is, in crocheting, you crochet the same stitch on the front and back, right? In knitting, you knit on the right sides and purl on the wrong sides. You have 2 different types of stitches you make if you want to get a stockinette stitch, which is kind of this stitch, the flat stitch. And purl stitches take almost twice as long to make as knit stitches. So every row where you have to purl will take twice as long as every row where you have to knit. So if you need to go back and forth knitting and purling, it will just take you longer than if you can knit something in the round. And obviously if you have a cardigan like this one, like this upper section, you can't knit in the round, you have to knit flat. But then for instance the sleeves here, I could actually knit in the round, which made them go much faster. So this is my number one tip, is learn how to knit in the round really soon, and then use knitting in the round as often as you can, because you'll be way faster with your projects. And not only faster, you will also be much more regular in your knitting, because purl stitches sometimes are a bit looser than knit stitches, and this can be visible. And so just learn how to knit in a round from the beginning on. And if you want to start with a sweater like I did, just knit your first sweater in the round. It's gonna be so much more easy. The things you will have to learn to construct a sweater, like increasing, learning how to make one left and make one right, you can focus on these parts, and the other parts are just repetitive, just knitting in the round. Only construct in the round as much as you can, construct in one go as much as you can. Now my next tip is something that I really didn't want to hear first, and I saw many videos mentioning as well. So you really have to gauge swatch. For me in crocheting, I didn't really mind not gauge swatching. I didn't feel like my stitches were off by a lot, and if something didn't fit, I would just add a row here and there, and I didn't really do the gauge swatching at all. But in knitting, it's so essential, because if you follow my first tip and make your life much easier by knitting things in the round, you will not have any seams or something where you can add stitches later, where you can make something wider. So if something is too small, because you use the same needle size and the same yarn as in a pattern, but your stitch tension is way different than what the person who made the pattern has in their stitch tension, and you knit it and then it's too small, there's not much you can do. There's only little wiggle room to kind of stretch that out, but it's just not fun. So you really need to do your gauge swatches, and you really need to block your gauge swatches, because blocking in knitting is much more essential. And you will want to have your gauge swatch after blocking, because that's actually how your garment is going to be once you start wearing it. So that's your final size. So knit a gauge swatch, block it, and just really do it, especially when you have like lace pattern or color work pattern. It's a good moment to practice your stitches anyway. So really get into that, do your gauge swatching. It's so important in knitting. This is maybe a tip that is harder to follow, but something I just want to make you aware of from the start. If you find a mistake, just fix it the moment you see it, because unraveling with crocheting is much easier, because you just take your hook out and then you like pull the strand back to the stitch where you made the mistake, and then you just continue again from there. If you have a mistake in knitting, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you bargained with yourself and you thought like, oh, I'm not gonna open that now, like it's gonna be fine, and then later it bothers you too much, and so you still have to go back. You have to either knit backwards, so go into every stitch and open it again, which is a very annoying thing to do, like I hate that, or you have to kind of drop all your stitches off your needles, open it, rip it back to where you made the mistake, and then pick up all the stitches again, where stitches can get twisted or split or open in some rows further than you wanted to, and then you have to re-knit those. There is a possibility, if it's just one stitch or like an easy fixable mistake, where you can just drop the stitch and then knit that back up again. That's very easy to fix, but if it's something bigger than that, just fix it right away. I just want you to be warned that it's really much more annoying to unravel, and especially when crocheting, just started trying out things and trying out sizes and then just ripping back if it wasn't right and then doing it again. And in knitting, that is much more annoying. So I really would not recommend you doing that, and recommend you fixing a mistake right away. Okay, so in in crochet you don't really have an issue with like casting off. It's not a big thing. You can just stop and have the uppermost row be your final row and it looks nice, and that's fine. Maybe you will do some edging or something, but you don't have to actually cast off, right? And your start is almost always a chain, but in knitting it's actually quite essential which method you choose to cast on and cast off. And there are like the regular or most widely used cast on, and also a most widely used cast off, like the easiest cast off method, or like, yeah, just the most often used, I guess. But if you, for instance, knit a collar for a turtleneck, which will later have to fit over your head, you will need a more stretchy cast on. And for instance, for hems, you will sometimes also need more stretchy cast offs. And that's when you need a different cast on and or cast off method. For instance, very often used for cast on is the backwards loop cast on method, but only put on loops which you're going to knit afterwards, and then you have the stretchiness of the fabric in general on your cast on edge. And for casting off, there is the tubular bind off of the Italian cast off method that just make your edge a bit stretchier and also can give it a different finish, which you can use if you want to adjust the look or something. But that is much more essential in knitting and something to keep in mind, especially if you start working with patterns and they ask for a specific cast on or cast off method. Oftentimes there's a reason they do that. If it's a good pattern, it's explained why, and if it's not, then still maybe stick with the method they ask for. If it says nothing, you can go with the regular cast on or cast off methods. But if it says to loosely cast on, go quickly look up that method. You're gonna be very thankful that you use the right method once you're done with your garment, because then you won't run into the situation where your sweater doesn't fit over your head or something. So keep that in mind. Okay, my fifth tip is if you run into the issue I mentioned earlier, where when you do a stockinette stitch knitted flat, knitting the front rows and purling the back rows, then it can happen, especially in the beginning when you're a beginner knitter, that the purl stitches look a bit wider than the knit stitches, so it looks a bit irregular afterwards. And that is also something you will notice while gauge swatching, which again makes gauge swatching so important. If that happens to you, you can use the larger needle for the knit rows and a smaller needle for the purl rows, but you can vary between that. There's no rule saying you need to always use the same 2 needle sizes in one go. And also, if you work with interchangeable needles, you can just screw on one needle size on one side and the other on the other side and vary it that way. And so that is really something that can be very useful in the beginning. When I look at this first sweater I knitted, especially here, you see that these stitches are much larger than these, so I could have used that method for my first sweater. But yeah, that is just something many people recommend that. There are even some more experienced knitters that still do that later on, but that is something to keep in mind. And another instance to vary your needle size in is for cuffs and collars and hems. When I crocheted, I didn't often vary the needle size. I would maybe go down 0.5 millimeter in needle size for a hem or a cuff or something. If you're like me in knitting, that is much more essential. So if I knit, for instance, with a size 8 millimeter needle for kind of the body of my project, then I use for the hem and kind of the edging, I use a needle that is 2 millimeters smaller, so a size 6 millimeter. And then on the lower end, when you knit with, for instance, 4 millimeter needles, you can also just go down 1 millimeter, so go from a 4 millimeter to a 3 millimeter or maybe a 2.5, but there you don't really need to go down 2 needle sizes, like 1.5 is enough, but just keep that in mind. Most patterns will actually ask for that. Most patterns will tell you to get 2 different needle sizes and use the smaller ones on hems and cuffs, etc. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so my next tip is to, if you already kind of started knitting and you know you want to keep on doing this craft, like once you really realize you will keep on this, I can highly recommend investing in an interchangeable needle set. Now, these can be a bit more pricey, but as a beginner you don't necessarily need to get the fanciest needles or like the largest sets or whatever, but get a set that has like the most regular needle sizes, which are from maybe 3.5 millimeters to 8 millimeters, maybe sometimes 10 millimeters. I will indicate the US sizes. Just get a needle set right away with interchangeables. And interchangeable means that you screw on the needle onto a cable and you can kind of switch the cable. So if for a color you need a small circumference, you can use a 60 centimeter cable and put your needles onto that. And then once you start decreasing and the fabric starts to grow in width, you can just screw your needles onto another cable and then knit with that cable and then transfer it like that onto a maybe 100 centimeter cable or whatever the pattern calls for or what feels the best to you. And the other advantage of using interchangeables is that when you have to set, for instance, stitches aside for your sleeves, which for instance this cardigan I constructed by putting on this side and this side, putting the stitches on hold and just knit on here, so I have no gap or picked up stitches or anything here. If you want to do that, then having a cable is also very useful because you can just use a different cable, transfer the stitches onto that cable, and then just screw on the stitch stoppers onto the end of the cable and leave it there. And when you get back to the sleeve and want to work on the sleeve, all you need to do is screw on your needle onto that cable and then you can just continue knitting. And an additional bonus for that is when you actually want to try on your project while you're knitting your body and you want to see if the armholes are large enough and sit nicely, then it's really good if you have it on a cable, because you then have an opening where you can actually put your arm through. On a stitch holder, the stitches will be like pulled together, so you couldn't try it on as well, and so that's also an advantage. So the next tip adds a bit onto the gauge swatching and the tip I gave you there. So you really do need to block your knits. If you're anything like me, when I crocheted, I didn't really block my crochet projects after making them. I would wear them right away. And that was mostly because I was too impatient to wait to block it, but also because I didn't really look up what blocking meant. And to give you a quick rundown, blocking is the process of once you're done with the project, when everything is done and you've also woven in all your ends, you submerge it into lukewarm or cold water. I oftentimes put some wool detergent in there as well, and you leave it in there for 10 to 15 minutes. Afterwards you press out the water, but not twist it or kind of don't pull the fabric apart. You don't want to stretch the stitches, but just like knead it a bit until you pressed out all the water, and then you put it in between two towels, roll them up, then you have kind of a towel burrito, and then I will just step on it and kind of turn the burrito a bit and step on it from some other sides, and then I take it out and I lay it somewhere that has like a lot of airflow. I lay it flat to dry and wait until it's fully dried. And when you lay it flat there, you also already put it into the right shape. I oftentimes use my laundry hamper and don't open it entirely, because if it's closed it kind of has a grid on top where I could just lay my project onto flat. But there are also blocking mats you can get. You don't need to get them, but if you want to, you can. So that is the process of blocking. But what it does, and that's the most important part, first of all, it softens your stitches. So you have to imagine that when you put it into a new shape through knitting, there's tension on the strand, which means that if you put it into water, you kind of soften these fibers and the tension relaxes and gives the yarn the chance to form into this new shape. When it dries afterwards in its new shape, then it kind of sets nicely in it. This also means that your stitches will get more regular. It helps to kind of even out the stitches. There's a lot you can correct through that. And very importantly, if you work with color work, meaning working with several color at a time and carrying the strand in the back, or if you knit in lace patterns, blocking is so important. Also for cable knits, it's so important that you block it, because when you block it, that's kind of when the pattern starts to look the nicest. And also another point, it softens the fabric. And with every single time you wash it the same way, when you wash your knits, you don't put them into a machine, you do it the same way. You don't need more than that. That will clean it, and you also don't need to wash it often with wool. That's not necessary. And it has a substance in it, lanolin, that comes from the sheepskin, which is antibacterial as well, so you don't need to wash it as often. But yeah, you really need to block your knits. It's essential. Just do it. Once you started blocking, you will never not block anymore. Okay, so my final tip, if you want to start knitting as a crocheter, when I crocheted, I would usually always use needles with aluminum or steel tips. I didn't really like the wooden textures in crocheting. I thought that it had too much traction, and it was just much more tiring on my hands, much faster. When it comes to knitting, that's actually entirely different for me. So it's a personal preference, but in general, if you have high traction needle, so if you have a needle with a non-buffed or non-sealed surface, it can have much more texture, which means that the friction between the yarn and the needle is a bit higher. And that can be an advantage in some projects where you don't want your stitches to slip off the needles as fast, because some yarn is a bit more slippery. So adjust your type of needle in knitting to the type of yarn and the type of project you're making. Which means, more specifically, I personally use wooden needles for yarns that are a bit more slippery. On the other hand, when I work with only merino yarns, or if I work with more chunky wool, I always go for aluminum needles. There I find it goes much faster for me and much easier for me, because the stitch is already so big that I won't have a hard time actually catching the stitch when I poke the needle in. If you're still a beginner, you can absolutely work with one needle type. I would not recommend you getting aluminum needles as a beginner, because they're so slippery. You might lose stitches from time to time. And so yeah, I would recommend to you to adjust the type of needle you're using to the type of yarn you're using and the pattern you're making. This was the first part of this two-part series. Next week we're going to look at what I think are the pros and cons of knitting and compare the two. And then finally I'll tell you, now that I know both knitting and crocheting, when I use knitting and when I use crocheting, and for which things I think each craft is more useful for, or I just prefer. So come back next week, watch the second part, and I wish you a lovely week. Bye!